I was standing in my driveway at 6 a.m., still in my pajamas, staring at a bright orange notice taped to my front door. My hands were shaking as I read the words. Final violation notice, $500 daily fine effective immediately lien. Proceedings to begin in 72 hours. The violation? My garden hose was allegedly improperly stored because it was coiled next to my house instead of hidden from view. A garden hose. They were threatening to put a lien on my home over a garden hose. But here's the thing, I had checked the HOA guidelines the night before. There was absolutely nothing about garden hose storage. Nothing. This wasn't about rules or regulations. This was personal, and I was about to find out just how personal it could get. My neighbor, Patricia Morrison, was standing across the street in her perfectly manicured yard, arms crossed, watching me with this satisfied smirk on her face. She gave me a little wave, not friendly, but territorial, like she was marking her victory. That's when I realized what I was really dealing with. This wasn't going to stop with a garden hose. Patricia had somehow weaponized our HOA, and she was coming for me. For 2 years, she would make my life a living hell, using every petty rule and regulation she could twist to her advantage. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how this nightmare began, and, more importantly, how I finally ended it. 6 months earlier, my wife Sarah and I had been so excited to buy our first home. After years of cramped apartments and saving every penny, we finally found our dream house in Willowbrook Estates, a beautiful planned community with tree-lined streets, perfectly maintained common areas, and what we thought was a reasonable HOA. "Look at this place," Sarah had said during our first walkthrough, her eyes lighting up as she ran her fingers along the granite countertops. "It's like something out of a magazine." The house was everything we dreamed of: 3 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, a 2-car garage, and a backyard perfect for the kids we were planning to have. The neighborhood seemed idyllic. Families walking their dogs, kids riding bikes, neighbors chatting over fences. The American dream, right there in suburbia. Our realtor, a chatty woman named Linda, had mentioned the HOA almost as an afterthought. "Oh, and there's a homeowners association," she'd said, flipping through her paperwork. "Just the usual stuff, keeping property values up, maintaining common areas. The fees are reasonable, and they're not too strict." Famous last words. I remember our first HOA meeting. It was held in the community center, a modest building that doubled as a rental space for birthday parties and wedding receptions. About 20 residents showed up, most of them retirees who seemed to take the whole thing very seriously. The board president was a soft-spoken man in his 70s named Bob Chin, who ran the meeting with the efficiency of someone who'd been doing this for decades. The treasurer gave a budget report. They discussed plans for new playground equipment, and they voted on a proposal to add speed bumps to Maple Street. It all seemed normal, boring even. That's when I first noticed Patricia Morrison. She sat in the front row, a woman in her early 60s, with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun and reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. She had a thick binder in front of her and took notes constantly, her pen scratching across the paper with urgent intensity. "I'd like to raise a concern about property maintenance standards," she said, during the open floor portion of the meeting, her voice crisp and authoritative. "I've noticed several violations throughout the community that are being overlooked." She proceeded to list off a series of incredibly minor infractions. Someone's trash can lid wasn't completely closed. A neighbor's car was parked slightly over their driveway edge. Another house had a small oil stain on their concrete. "These may seem like small issues," Patricia continued, "but they're exactly the kind of thing that leads to neighborhood decline. Property values depend on everyone following the rules." A few people nodded along, but I caught some eye rolls from the younger residents. Bob Chin thanked her for her diligence and promised the board would look into the issues she'd raised. After the meeting, Sarah and I introduced ourselves to some of our neighbors. Everyone seemed friendly enough, though several people made subtle references To Patricia. "Oh, you bought the house on Oak Street," said our next-door neighbor, Mike. "That's great. Just a heads up about Patricia. She's very involved in neighborhood affairs." Another neighbor, Jenny, lowered her voice conspiratorially. "Patricia means well, but she can be a bit intense about the HOA rules. She's been here since the community was built 15 years ago, and she knows every regulation by heart." At the time, we laughed it off. We were rule followers by nature. We kept our yard tidy, our house maintained, our cars in the garage. What could possibly go wrong? Looking back, I think our mistake was being too visible during those first few weeks. We were excited new homeowners, constantly working on projects, having friends over, making noise as we settled in. Sarah loved gardening and spent hours outside planting flowers and vegetables. I enjoyed working on the house, fixing little things, painting, upgrading fixtures. We were happy. We were enthusiastic. And apparently, that made us a target. The first violation notice came 3 weeks after we moved in. I found it tucked under our doormat when I got home from work, official looking. Form with the HOA letterhead and a checkbox marked landscaping. Violation. Failure to maintain approved grass height. It read, "Grass exceeds maximum allowable height of 3 inches. Remedy required within 72 hours or fine will be assessed." I stood there staring at the paper, completely confused. I had mowed our lawn just 5 days earlier. I walked around to the backyard and examined our grass. It looked perfectly normal to me. Maybe it was getting a little long in a few spots, but nothing crazy. "Maybe they have different standards here," Sarah said when I showed her the notice. "Let's just mow it again." So I did. I spent my Saturday morning cutting grass that didn't really need cutting, telling myself this was just part of living in a nice community. 2 weeks later, another notice. This time it was about our unauthorized outdoor storage. Apparently, leaving our bicycles on our front porch violated some regulation about keeping the front of the house uncluttered. But the Martinez family 3 houses down has bikes on their porch, Sarah pointed out, and she was right. In fact, as we walked around the neighborhood that evening, we saw all sorts of things on people's porches: flower pots, welcome mats, decorations, even furniture. I called the HOA management company, a firm called Community First that handled several neighborhoods in the area. The woman who answered the phone was polite but unhelpful. "I can see you've received a violation notice," she said in a practiced, neutral tone. "The board members who patrol the community reported the violation. If you believe it was issued in error, you can request a hearing, but in the meantime, the violation stands." A hearing? For bicycles on our own porch? I moved the bikes to the garage and tried to put it out of my mind, but the notices kept coming. Every 2 or 3 weeks, another violation would appear. Our mailbox post needed to be repainted, even though it looked identical to every other mailbox on the street. Our trash cans were visible from the street on a non-collection day because I'd forgotten to bring them in after work. Our garden hose was improperly stored because it was coiled next to the house instead of hidden behind it. Each violation came with a fine if not corrected within 72 hours, usually $25 to $50. We always fixed whatever they complained about, but the fines kept escalating. Second offense, $75. Third offense, $100. What made it even more frustrating was the inconsistency. I started paying attention to other houses in the neighborhood, and I saw the same violations everywhere. Half the mailboxes needed touching up. Everyone had visible trash cans at some point during the week. Garden hoses, bikes, outdoor furniture was all over the place, but only we seemed to be getting notices. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening in October. I was in the kitchen, making dinner, when I heard Sarah crying in the living room. I found her sitting on our couch, holding 2 pieces of paper, tears streaming down her face. "What's wrong?" I asked, sitting down beside her. She handed me the papers without saying anything. The first was another violation notice, this one for excessive noise during quiet hours. Apparently, Someone had complained that we were playing loud music after 10 p.m. on a school night. The second paper was a fine notice, $200, for a noise violation. We weren't even home last night, Sarah said through her tears. We were at your sister's birthday dinner until almost midnight. There's no way we were playing loud music. She was right. We'd been at a restaurant across town until 1130, then drove straight home and went to bed. Someone had either made a mistake or they were lying. This is harassment, I said, anger rising in my chest. This is absolutely harassment. I called the management company again, this time demanding to speak to a supervisor. When I explained the situation, the woman on the phone sounded sympathetic but ultimately powerless. I understand your frustration, Mr. Johnson, she said, but the board members are volunteers from your community, and we have to take their report seriously. If you want to dispute the violation, you'll need to attend the next board meeting and present your case. The next board meeting was 3 weeks away. That night, I decided to do some investigating. I printed out our entire HOA rulebook from the community website and started reading through it line by line. What I found was eye-opening. The rules were incredibly vague and subjective. Maintain appropriate landscaping. Keep exterior areas tidy. Avoid excessive noise. There were no specific measurements, no clear definitions, no objective standards. Even more interesting was the enforcement section. According to the bylaws, violation reports had to be submitted by board members during their monthly neighborhood inspections. But board members were supposed to rotate different sections of the community each month to ensure fair enforcement. I started mapping out the violations we'd received against the dates and the areas that should have been inspected. The pattern that emerged made my blood boil. Every single violation we'd received had come during weeks when Patricia Morrison was scheduled to inspect our section of the neighborhood. Every single one. I brought this information to the next board meeting, along with photos I'd taken of identical violations at other houses in the community. I'd spent hours documenting everything: mailboxes, grass height, outdoor storage, you name it. The meeting was held on a cold November evening, and about 15 residents showed up. When it came time for new business, I raised my hand. I'd like to address what appears to be selective enforcement of HOA regulations, I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline pumping through my veins. Bob Chen, the board president, nodded politely. Please go ahead. I presented my evidence methodically. The pattern of violations, the photos showing identical conditions at other houses, the impossible noise complaint from a night when we weren't even home. It appears that one board member is targeting my family with frivolous violations, while ignoring the same conditions at other properties. I concluded. This isn't fair enforcement, it's harassment. The room was dead silent. I could feel Patricia Morrison's eyes boring into me from the front row, but I didn't look at her. Bob Chen cleared his throat. Thank you for bringing this to our attention, Mr. Johnson. The board will review your concerns and get back to you. When? I asked. Because in the meantime, we're being fined hundreds of dollars for violations that don't exist or aren't being fairly enforced. Within 30 days, Bob said firmly, clearly wanting to move on. As the meeting broke up, Patricia Morrison approached me near the exit. She was smiling, but it didn't reach her eyes. Mr. Johnson, she said, her voice sweet as honey. I hope you understand that. We all want what's best for the community. Property values depend on everyone following the same standards. That's exactly my point, I replied. Everyone should follow the same standards, not just my family. Her smile faltered slightly. I'm sure any discrepancies will be resolved soon. In the meantime, I hope you'll continue to be a good neighbor. There was something in the way she said, good neighbor, that sent a chill down my spine. 2 days later, I found a new violation notice on my door. This one was different. Instead of the usual minor infractions, it was for unauthorized structural modifications. The violation We had installed a small decorative garden border around our flower bed, the kind of plastic edging you can buy at any home improvement store. According to Patricia's report, this constituted a structural modification that required architectural approval from the HOA board. The fine was $500. That's when I realized that my presentation at the board meeting hadn't solved anything. It had escalated everything. Patricia Morrison wasn't going to stop. If anything, she was just getting started. The garden border fine was the last straw. $500 for 10 feet of plastic edging that cost me $20 at Home Depot. I was done playing defense. That weekend, I drove to the county courthouse and spent 6 hours in the public records office. If Patricia Morrison wanted to play hardball, I was going to learn the rules of the game. What I discovered over the next several weeks changed everything. First, I pulled the incorporation documents for our HOA. Willowbrook Estates Community Association had been established in 2008, and the original board of directors included the community developer and several early homeowners. Patricia Morrison had joined the board in 2010, just 2 years after the community was built. But here's what was interesting. According to the annual reports filed with the state, Patricia had been president of the HOA board for 11 of the past 13 years. Bob Chen, who I thought was in charge, had only been listed as president for the past 6 months. I dug deeper into the financial records that HOAs are required to file publicly. The numbers were eye-opening. Over the past 5 years, the association had collected over $180,000 in violation fines. For a community of just 200 homes, that was an average of $180 per household per year in fines alone, on top of the regular HOA dues. Even more suspicious was how that money was being spent. Nearly $60,000 had gone to administrative and legal fees, paid to something called Morrison Property Services. Morrison Property Services. I Googled the company and found a bare-bones website advertising HOA management and enforcement consulting. The business address was a P.O. box, but the state business registration listed Patricia Morrison as the sole proprietor. She was fining residents and then paying herself from the association's account to provide consulting services. I sat back in my desk chair, staring at the computer screen, pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. This wasn't just harassment. It was a racket. But the most damning evidence came when I requested copies of all violation reports from the past 2 years through a formal HOA records request. As a homeowner, I had the legal right to review association documents, and the management company had to provide them within 30 days. When the records arrived, I spread them out on my dining room table and started categorizing them. What I found was a pattern of systematic targeting that went far beyond just my family. Patricia had been issuing violations to specific houses in a rotating pattern, always staying just under the threshold that might trigger a formal complaint. She'd hit a house with 3-4 violations over a few months, collect the fines, then move on to the next target. But some households had been hit much harder than others. The Patel family on Elm Street had received 23 violations in 2 years. The young couple who'd moved in across from the community center had gotten 19. An elderly man living alone on Birch Avenue had been fined 16 times. I started to see the common factors: new residents, young families, people who worked long hours and might not have time to attend board meetings or fight back. Patricia was preying on the most vulnerable homeowners in the community. The noise violation that had made Sarah cry, the one from the night we weren't even home, appeared on a list of similar complaints. In fact, Patricia had filed noise violations against 7 different houses on 7 different nights in the past year, all between 10 p.m. and midnight, all during weeknights. Either our neighborhood had an epidemic of late-night parties, or Patricia was making up violations to generate fine revenue. I made copies of everything and drove to the office of a lawyer my brother-in-law had recommended, a woman named Carol Martinez, who specialized in HOA disputes. Carol was in her 40s, with graying hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing as I laid out my evidence across her conference table. "This is quite a collection," she said, reviewing the financial records. "And you're saying this Morrison Property Services is owned by the same person who's been issuing all these violations?" "That's right. She's essentially finding homeowners and then paying herself from the HOA's account." Carol nodded grimly. "That's a clear conflict of interest and potentially embezzlement depending on how the board approved these payments." "What about the other board members? Are they aware of what's happening?" "I don't think so. Bob Chin seems like a decent guy, but he's only been president for 6 months. I think Patricia's been running things behind the scenes for years." "And these violation reports," Carol continued, flipping through the stack of papers. "Some of these are clearly fabricated. You can't get a noise violation for a night when you weren't home, and you have documentation proving you were elsewhere." She leaned back in her chair, thinking, "Mr. Johnson, what you've uncovered here goes beyond simple HOA harassment. This is organized fraud. The question is, what do you want to do about it?" I knew exactly what I wanted to do. I want to stop her, not just for my family, but for everyone she's been stealing from. Carol smiled for the first time since I'd walked into her office. "Then let's get to work." Our plan was surgical and devastating. Carol helped me prepare a formal complaint to the State Attorney General's office, documenting the financial irregularities and false violation reports. But we weren't going to file it right away. First, we wanted to give Patricia enough rope to hang herself. The next step was building a coalition of affected homeowners. I started by reaching out to the families who'd received the most violations: the Patels, the young couple, the elderly man on Birch Avenue. The response was immediate and overwhelming. "We thought we were the only ones," Mrs. Patel told me when I showed her the violation records. "We've paid over $800 in fines in the past year." My husband wanted to fight it, but we were worried about making things worse. The young couple, Jake and Amy, had a similar story. "We're both working 2 jobs to afford this house," Jake said. "Every fine feels like it's designed to break us financially." Even more heartbreaking was my conversation with Harold, the elderly man on Birch Avenue. He was 82 years old and living on a fixed income. Patricia had been fining him for things like failure to maintain curb appeal because his arthritis made it difficult for him to do yard work. "I've been thinking about selling," he told me sadly. "I can't keep up with all these fines. This used to be such a nice, quiet neighborhood." Within 2 weeks, I had documented stories from 18 different families who'd been systematically targeted by Patricia's enforcement scheme. The total amount stolen through fraudulent fines exceeded $25,000. Carol helped me prepare a presentation for the next board meeting, but this time, we weren't going alone. We coordinated with all the affected families to show up together. The December board meeting was standing room only. Nearly 50 residents packed into the community center, many of them holding folders of their own, violation notices, and financial records. Bob Chin looked genuinely surprised by the turnout. Patricia, sitting in her usual front row seat, had her poker face on, but I could see tension in her shoulders. "We have quite a crowd tonight," Bob said as he called the meeting to order. "I assume this has to do with the concerns Mr. Johnson raised last month." "It does," I said, standing up, "but it's much bigger than my concerns. We've discovered a pattern of financial fraud and abuse that's been going on for years." The room buzzed with murmurs as I laid out our findings. The shell company receiving HOA funds, the fabricated violation reports, the systematic targeting of vulnerable homeowners. Patricia finally stood up, her face flushed with anger. "This is outrageous," she said, her voice shaking. "I have devoted 15 years of my life to this community. I've volunteered countless hours to maintain our property values and standards. How dare you accuse me of—" "Mrs. Morrison," Carol interrupted, standing up from the back of the room. "I'm an attorney representing several homeowners in this community. Before you say Anything else, I'd advise you to consider that making false statements in a public forum could constitute defamation. Patricia's mouth snapped shut. Bobchin looked back and forth between us, clearly out of his depth. I think we need to adjourn this meeting and schedule an emergency board session to review these allegations. Actually, Carol said, we'd like to make a formal motion to remove Mrs. Morrison from the board pending an investigation into these financial irregularities. The room erupted in voices. Some people were shouting second. Others were arguing. Patricia Morrison stormed out, slamming the community center door behind her. But we weren't done. 3 days later, Carol filed our complaint with the state attorney general. The same day, I sent a detailed report to the management company outlining Patricia's conflicts of interest and demanding an immediate audit of all HOA finances. The response was swift and brutal. Within a week, Community First Management sent a letter to all homeowners, announcing that they were terminating their contract with Willowbrook Estates. Effective immediately, they discovered financial irregularities that made it impossible for them to continue managing the association. The State Attorney General's office launched a formal investigation into Patricia Morrison and Morrison Property Services. News of the investigation spread quickly through the neighborhood, and more families came forward with their own stories of harassment and fraudulent fines. But Patricia wasn't going down without a fight. On New Year's Eve, Sarah and I came home from a party to find our house vandalized. Someone had spray-painted "Troublemaker" across our garage door and scattered trash all over our front yard. We called the police, and while we couldn't prove who did it, the timing was awfully convenient. Patricia lived just 2 streets away, and she'd made it clear that she considered us public enemy number 1. The vandalism backfired on her. Photos of our garage spread through the neighborhood, and the sympathy swung completely in our favor. Even residents who'd initially supported Patricia began to distance themselves from her increasingly erratic behavior. The final blow came in February, when the State Attorney General's office filed criminal charges against Patricia Morrison for embezzlement, fraud, and filing false police reports. The false police reports charge was for all the fabricated noise violations. Apparently, filing a fake HOA violation is one thing, but when you claim it involves disturbing the peace, it becomes a criminal matter. Patricia hired a lawyer and tried to fight the charges, but the evidence was overwhelming. She'd been sloppy about covering her tracks, and we had paper trails going back 5 years. In March, faced with a mountain of evidence against her, Patricia Morrison pled guilty to embezzlement and agreed to pay full restitution to the HOA. She was sentenced to 2 years of probation and 200 hours of community service. But the best part was the restraining order. As part of her plea agreement, Patricia was banned from serving on any HOA board and prohibited from entering the Willowbrook Estates community except to access her own property. She couldn't attend board meetings, couldn't patrol the neighborhood, and couldn't harass any residents. She moved out of the community 3 months later. The transformation of our neighborhood after Patricia's departure was remarkable. Bobchin stepped up as a real leader, working with the remaining board members to completely overhaul our HOA's enforcement policies. They hired a new management company and implemented clear, objective standards for all regulations. Violation reports now required photo evidence and had to be reviewed by at least 2 board members before being issued. Most importantly, they established a process for residents to appeal violations without having to wait weeks for a board meeting. The restitution money from Patricia's settlement was used to refund fines to families who'd been targeted by her scheme. Harold, the elderly man on Birch Avenue, got back over $600, money he desperately needed for his medical expenses. "I never thought I'd see that money again," he told me with tears in his eyes. "You gave me back my peace of mind." The Patels used their refund to finally landscape their backyard the way they'd always wanted. "We were afraid to make any changes before," Mrs. Patel explained. "We thought Patricia would find some way to fine us for it." Jake and Amy, The young couple who'd been working 2 jobs took their refund and used it for a down payment on a better car. It feels like we can actually enjoy living here now, Amy said. We're not constantly looking over our shoulders, waiting for the next violation notice. As for Sarah and me, the experience changed us in ways we didn't expect. We'd learned that sometimes you have to fight for what's right, even when it feels overwhelming and scary. Sarah, who'd been so upset by that first noise violation, became one of the most active volunteers in our reformed HOA. She helped establish a neighborhood welcome committee to support new residents and make sure they understood their rights as homeowners. I never want another family to go through what we went through, she told me. Fear shouldn't be the price of homeownership. The legal fees cost us about $3,000, but Carol Martinez became a friend and eventually helped us recover most of that through a small claims action against Patricia for the cost of repairing our vandalized garage. More importantly, we learned to recognize the warning signs of HOA abuse and how to protect ourselves. We kept detailed records of everything, knew our rights as homeowners, and built relationships with our neighbors instead of just coexisting with them. The community garden that Sarah started in the common area became a symbol of our new beginning. Residents who'd been afraid to make any changes to their properties began working together to beautify shared spaces. Kids played in the streets again without their parents worrying about noise complaints. We even got a thank you card from the family who bought Patricia's old house. They were young teachers with a new baby, and they told us they'd heard about our fight against the HOA corruption. Thank you for making this a neighborhood where we can raise our daughter without fear, they wrote. One evening in late spring, almost a year after that first violation notice about our garden hose, I was sitting on our front porch with Sarah, watching the sunset paint our street in golden light. Neighbors were out walking their dogs, kids were riding bikes, and someone was grilling in their backyard. It was the peaceful suburban life we dreamed of when we first bought the house. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we hadn't fought back? Sarah asked, reaching over to squeeze my hand. I thought about it for a moment. Harold probably would have been forced to sell his house. The Patels might have given up on their American dream. Patricia would still be stealing from families and making their lives miserable. And we would have learned to live in fear, Sarah added, always wondering what arbitrary rule we'd violated, always waiting for the next fine. She was right. The money was never really the point. It was about the principle that homeowners deserve to be treated fairly, that communities should bring out the best in people, not weaponize petty rules to create fear and division. I learned that most people are good, decent, and reasonable, but systems can be corrupted by those who seek power over others. Patricia Morrison wasn't evil. She was insecure and controlling, and she'd found a way to make herself feel important by making others feel small. But I also learned that when good people work together, they can overcome almost any abuse of power. Our neighborhood didn't need a dictator disguised as a volunteer. It needed engaged residents who cared about each other as much as they cared about property values. The garden hose that started this whole nightmare is still coiled next to our house, right where I left it that morning when I found the final violation notice. But now it waters Sarah's community garden, brings neighbors together for summer barbecues, and helps us maintain the kind of home we actually want to live in. Sometimes I drive past Patricia's old house and think about the lessons she taught me without meaning to. The only way to stop a bully is to stand up to them. And the only way to protect your community is to care enough about it to fight for what's right. Our HOA still has rules, but now they make sense. They're applied fairly, consistently, and with common sense. Most importantly, they serve the community instead of the other way around. And if anyone ever tries to fine me for the way I store my garden hose again, well, let's just say I know a really good lawyer.